Hello, this is Dr. Cisse covering anatomy and physiology. Today, we'll talk about the skull, the human skull. Let's review the names of the bones and we'll talk about the bone marking. The frontal, parietal, we have two of them, temporal, right here, temporal, occipital to the back, occipital, right here, this one. Then we have the sphenoid inside here, but I can show you from inside also, the sphenoid right here, this bone here. So if I go like this, I'm touching the sphenoid and the sphenoid right here, the sphenoid. And the ethmoid, which is inside here, if I go in, you will see from the back here, the ethmoid. Now, these are the cranial bone, because the skull is divided into cranial and facial. On the facial, right, the facial bone, we have nasal, lacrimal, zygomatic, maxilla, vomer, inferior nasal concha, palatine, right here, I'm gonna go back here, palatine. Remember, this is the maxilla. If I continue, I'll touch the palatine here. The mandible, So let's go back again. Nasal, lacrimal, zygomatic, maxilla, vomer, inferior nasal concha, mandible, and then palatine. Now, today's video is not talking about the bone itself, but the bone marking. What do you need to know about each bone? Let's start with the frontal bone. For the frontal, do you see, if I put the frontal together, this is the front continue all the way here, up to up here, right? It goes into the eye socket. So what I want you to know here is, do you see this little notch here? This little hole here? It's not a hole, it's like a little notch. But on this skull, for example, on this one, it's like a hole, right? Now, because this is the orbit, and it's above the orbit, we call it the superior orbital foramen. Superior means what? On top, orbital foramen. But if it's a notch, if it's not a complete hole, it's a half hole, it's called the superior orbital notch. So on the frontal, you need to know that. Now, if you look at the skull, you will see that the bones of the cranial part of the skull are attached by joints. These joints are called suture. We got 4 sutures we need to know. The one attaching the frontal bone to the parietal bones is called the coronal suture. Coronal suture or frontal suture. The one that is between the two parietal bones are called the sagittal suture. The sagittal suture. The one connecting the occipital bone with the two parietal bone is called the lambdoid. The reason why it's called lambdoid, it looks like lambda. Remember alpha, beta, lambda? Lambdoid. Sagittal is in the middle, sagittal. Frontal is in the front, or coronal, it looks like a crown, right? Then when you come here, the one connecting the temporal bone with the parietal, with part of the frontal, part of the occipital, is called the squamous suture. Just like the squamous cell. It looks like a scale, like a fish scale. That's why it's called squamous. So let's go back. Frontal or coronal, sagittal, lambdoid, and squamous. Those can be the suture. Now let's go back to the bone and talk about what do we need to know about each bone as we're going. For the parietal bone, we just kind of parietal. We don't have a lot to say about parietal. But if you come to the temporal bone, we have a lot to say about temporal. Look at that. You see this little big bump here? This big bump is called the mastoid process. Mastoid process. Then next to it, you see a small one next to it. If I turn this, we can see it right here. This little one here. This one is called the styloid process. Styloid process, mastoid process. Styloid process, mastoid process. Then, if you look at this little hole here, it would be your ear hole in the bone. This is going to be the external acoustic meatus. External acoustic meatus. So on the temporal bone, mastoid process, styloid process, external acoustic meatus. And then this little area here, because this is called the squamous suture, this is called the squamous part or the squamous surface. It's just a little part here. Then the squamous has a little extension called the process. That extension of the temporal bone is going towards what bone? The zygomatic bone, the zygomatic. So this process is called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, okay? Then when we come to the back for the occipital bone, the occipital bone, you see a big hole here at the bottom of it? That's called the foramen magnum. What does foramen mean? A hole. What is a magnum? Big hole. So foramen. Then if you come here, you will see the occipital protuberance. Protuberance just means a little extension. Then when you come here, this bone, the occipital bone, will sit on the C1. You remember? The atlas, the big one. Remember the atlas and axis? Yeah, the atlas. And then this is a condyle. A condyle just means the connection between two bones that will kind of roll bones on bone. So here, this is called the occipital condyle. Occipital condyle. So when you come here, on the occipital bone, if you think about it, we have, I'm gonna go back here. On the occipital bone, what else you need to know? Yes, I think that's it. But look at this one. The bottom jaw, remember the top jaw is what? The maxilla, the maxilla. On the maxilla, we have a hole here also. Remember this one is supraorbital foramen, below infraorbital foramen. And if there's two of them, infraorbital foramina, right? Then when we come to the face, of course you have the nasal bone here. We have the lacrimal here, and then on the lacrimal bone, you will see the lacrimal fossa. It's just a hole in the lacrimal bone. And then inside, there's a hole between your eye and your nose. That's why when you cry, you can suck your nose because you have tears going into your nose. You go through a lacrimal canal, right? It goes through a canal here. So you got lacrimal fossa. Then when we come to the face, we see the zygomatic bone. And the zygomatic bone, of course, is attached to the temporal bone, and the process of the temporal bone to the zygomatic is called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. At the same time, the process coming from the zygomatic bone to the temporal bone is called the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. So let me go back. The zygomatic process of the temporal bone is on the temporal bone, and the temporal process of the zygomatic bone is on the zygomatic bone. Right? So the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Now, when we come to the face here, of course, you see the vomer here, the vomer. And that if you follow the vomer, look at it. If you follow the vomer, you will see the vomer will extend to the ethmoid bone. That's why the middle part of the ethmoid is called the perpendicular plate. Why? It's perpendicular to your body. It's a plate because it's like a little line. It's like a bone dividing your head into left and eye. Right. Then, of course, you have the maxilla here with the teeth, and then the mandible. Now, if I go back here, you see what? The palatine. The palatine here. You see the extension here of the palatine here. So, and then when we come to the mandible, this is the only detachable. Normally, you shouldn't be able to take this part. We just did it for demonstration, right? Then, if you come to the mandible, you will see that it has teeth, obviously. And then when I come back here, you will see the mandibular notch. A condyle here, condyle just means it articulate with something. And what does it articulate with? If you put this back here, this one will be articulating with your temporal bone, right? So that's why this hole, this fossa in which you put the mandible is called the mandibular fossa on the temporal bone. So the mandibular fossa is called mandibular because it's the mandible that goes into that fossa on what bone? On the temporal bone, now on the mandibular bone. All right, so what else we have here? Then we have the coronoid process and the condylar process. And you have the what? The mandibular notch. Then here, we have holes here too. You see this hole? We'll talk about why we have these holes actually in the next one. So this whole is a foramen, right? So this one will be what? The mental foramen. Remember the mental region? Mental? Yes, mental foramen. And then the protuberance means just an extension. This is called the mental protuberance. On the back of the skull, on the occipital bone, is called the occipital protuberance. So you have one protuberance from the back, one protuberance from the front. Okay, what else we need to know? All right, 10 minutes already, so we need to stop it. I didn't want to go over 10 minutes. All right, so I hope you learn from this, and I'll see you in class. Thank you.